was slain, and his blood was poured out. Put on the frame for those in the house, now safe inside. As the angel passed them by, like them I cried. Cover me with the blood of your forgiveness, from the river of your holiness that flows with love. Cover me, the accuser standing o'er me is powerless before thee, for this my plea. Cover me, here on my knees, I reflect on the day.
Good evening. Thanks for tuning in to our Bible study of the book of Matthew. We've been working through the text now for several months, trying to understand, what the Holy Spirit inspired Matthew to write down for us, ultimately proving that Jesus is the promised Messiah. This is a book that truly comes alive as you study it, as it shows Jesus to be the one that was prophesied about. He is the one that has the correct lineage. He is the master teacher. He's the great healer, the great, miraculous Lord. And now we're finding that he can feed many people. He can provide all and provide true satisfaction. We are in Matthew chapter 16 tonight, so if you're following along, I encourage you to open up your Bibles, and we'll begin here in just a second. But Nick, to kind of segue into chapter 16, what are something that maybe stands out of what we looked at the last few weeks that we need to keep in mind as we get into this next section?
That is a good point.
That was a question,
That was a
actually.
good question.
Yes.
It's a good question because there are a lot of important things that we've discussed over the last several weeks that are leading up to this very point. And everybody knows where we're going because everybody knows what happens in chapter 16 and chapter 17, and everybody understands that there's going to be this moment of clarity for the disciples, or so we think, a moment of clarity. But for the last several chapters, there hasn't been much clarity for them about who Jesus is and why he's doing it.
And they're confused.
Nor has there been clarity from the religious leaders of the day. And so we keep going back to this question, right? Why are the religious leaders rejecting Jesus? I know they say that every week, but it's an important question. It's one that Wesley Walker pointed out. And when you start looking at the text of Matthew with that question in frame, you start to see things that you never saw before. You start to understand, well, why are they asking these outlandish questions about, why Jesus disobeys the law? Well, is he really disobeying the law, or is this just a bad heart? Why do your disciples not wash their hands before they eat and break the tradition of the elders? Well, why are they asking that? Well, what Matthew's pointing out is that they have a heart problem. And several times we've talked about this idea of good fruit and bad fruit. Good fruit is produced by a good heart. Bad fruit is produced by a bad heart. And they just are...
Which begs the question, what kind of heart do we have?
Right.
Yeah. This last miracle that we looked at, Curtis, here in chapter 15, was the feeding of the 4,000, not the 5,000. I already looked at the 4,000. But in both of those miracles where Jesus fed the crowds, is there anything that stood out to you?
Well, we're going to see again tonight, starting in chapter 16, that Matthew is repeating the same thing. He's getting the same message across. So you mentioned the 5,000 and then the 4,000. There's some similarities, but there's some differences. But the conclusion's the same, that all ate, all were satisfied, and there was plenty left over. And so we're seeing this hit that Matthew is going through and repeating some of these key points. And I think it's piggyback off of what Nick was saying, that it leads up to what we're going to look at next week is Peter's confession, and ultimately the transfiguration and the clarity that comes at that point in time. But Matthew is driving home these points.
Yeah, that Jesus is this great provider. Jesus provides true satisfaction. Jesus is compassionate. So why in the world would you reject him? And now later we're going to see that he's, Lord, the Son of God. Well, chapter 16, verse 1, it says, the Pharisees and Sadducees came up testing Jesus. Now notice that previously we have Pharisees and Sadducees separate. But
Pharisees and scribes are normally together.
Yeah, but now you have Pharisees and Sadducees. But did they usually get along?
No, there was a lot of political rift between them.
Yeah, we got Democrats and Republicans here working together now. Now, we always talk about if they can work across the aisle, good things will happen. When the Pharisees and Sadducees get together to test Jesus, it's not good. The Sadducees didn't believe in the afterlife. The Pharisees did, and they also held to the teachings of rabbis, and they looked down upon each other. They didn't agree with each other. But when it came to trying to test Jesus, all of a sudden they got along. Yeah. And that's bad.
Well, and it's Matthew clearly says that was the sole purpose of them coming.
Yeah.
They came to Jesus to test
To
him.
test him. They're not like, oh, hey, Jesus isn't bringing everybody together to learn the truth.
Yeah.
He's bringing people together and they're fighting him now.
Yeah, here's an opportunity to learn from this master teacher, this person who has done many wondrous things, this person who has shed clarity on what the law is and what we are to do, but they come here to test it.
I wonder what the background conversation of that maybe looked like. What Pharisee leader got together with some Sadducees and says, look, guys, we need to get over our differences and destroy Jesus? I mean, how do you have that kind of a heart problem like you mentioned, right? You have to have a serious heart problem to get together with a guy that's kind of you're at odds with and to say, hey, we need to work together to hurt someone else.
But it shows the influence that Jesus was having.
Yeah.
He was Matthew recounts the crowds on a regular basis. And here, what we mentioned last week, there's 4,000 men. There were 5,000 men. So Jesus is having tremendous influence.
Yeah.
And here, these guys, what is it? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so if the Sadducees have something against Jesus, the Pharisees have something
All of a
against
sudden,
Jesus.
they're going to get along.
Let's
So he
go.
unites everybody. He unites Jews and Gentiles and Pharisees and
uniting
Sadducees. Yeah,
God.
this isn't the kind of unity we want, but it did. It happened. So they come up to Jesus, chapter 16, verse 1 of Matthew, and they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. Now, this isn't the first time we've had a question like this of Jesus, right? What is it, back in chapter 12, I believe?
Yeah.
12:39.
38, 39.
Yeah, so they asked Jesus way back then. One of the scribes and Pharisees said, we want to see a sign. And here, the Pharisees and Sadducees say, let me see a sign from heaven, which Jesus has had a sign. He's had tons of signs.
Yeah.
The whole book is full of signs. What are they looking for, I wonder? What are they trying to do? How is this a test of Jesus?
I think it's interesting the way the sign that they ask for, because it says, show a sign from where?
Heaven.
From heaven. And so there was, from my understanding, a common Jewish teaching that heaven, or the air, which is repeated 4 times in these few verses, is the realm of God. Satan cannot do anything in the air. And so if you go back to the challenge, one of the initial challenges was that you're doing this by the power of Satan. And so show us a sign from heaven. So the signs that you have been performing have all been on the earth.
Okay.
That's Satan's realm. That's where you're able to do this with Satan's power. If you're truly the Son of God, show me a sign from heaven.
So it's an accusatory
Show me something from
thing.
the sky.
Yeah,
right?
do something up there, some kind of interstellar miracle of some kind.
And that's what, because I think we see sign 5 times, we see heaven 4 times. And that whole thought process is repeated.
But if the fact that they are accusing him this way, they're by asking for a sign from heaven, they're saying, we know your signs aren't real.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is very much designed to test Jesus. And is he going to do it? Because if Jesus kind of did a sign at their will, he's allowing them to influence them. He's already rejected this idea before. Even when Satan said, do these different miracles, Jesus said no. Yeah. He's not going to be someone's puppet and do a sign on your command.
Yeah.
Well, he knows why they're asking this.
Yeah, of
he
course.
knows why they're asking. So why do you ask malicious questions like this? Well, we want to discredit him.
Yeah.
Because we don't really think he's the Messiah. Because our picture and our view of who the Messiah is, he's a mighty warrior. He's going to free us from the Romans. And Jesus is that in a whole nother win. Their win and Jesus' win are 2 different wins. Jesus' win is uniting all of humanity under the ban of God. Their win is unite a group of Jewish people to defeat the Roman people so that we can have a kingdom that lasts forever. But they saw it differently. And that was the problem between what we're seeing. If we can discredit him, then we can prove that he's really not the Messiah, and we can get all these Jewish people to stop following him all over the place, healing their sick and doing all these different types of things. Yeah.
Well, if you think about the miracles he has done, the miracles he has done have to do with blessing the faith of somebody. You know, your faith has made you well, or maybe to build up someone else's faith, or to show compassion for other people. It was never, let me show my power to inflate my own ego.
It was never selfish.
Wrong. Yeah.
It was never selfish.
Which is just a sign of his great restraint, his
restraint,
great
meekness,
willingness to serve, humility.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
Yeah.
So Jesus replies to them and says, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. So here's something in the air that they look at, which comes from God, by the way, who created the sun and everything. So he says, you look at the sky, and when the sky is red, you go, oh, it's going to be fair weather the next morning. Now, I'm not that good at reading the sunset and knowing whether or not what clouds mean what, but apparently
meteorologists.
they had a way of doing this.
The red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. And so even that same thought process has continued on, that same pattern, the same acknowledgement of all these signs that have been seen. Just like we're able to see it today, they were able to see it back then.
Yeah.
So
all I
they're
know is
talking
right now
about-
we see fires right now. I see smoke
Everything-
everywhere.
the sun's
Everything's
red.
everything's
Right.
orange.
Right.
But so here's something that they understood. He says, here's a sign you see every day from God, or from me even, right? That, hey, the sky is red, fair weather. And in the morning, there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? He goes, look, you're not dumb.
Yeah.
You can look at the sky and figure out whether or not the weather is going to be good or bad. Why can't you see what's going on here? In my devotional, on Tuesday of this week, we talked about how in Ecclesiastes 11, he says, you look at the sky and by the clouds you can know if it's going to rain. Do you have common sense where you can look at the evidence in the sky and know what's happening?
Yeah.
The evidence is all around the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and yet they're still rejecting the sign from God. Thoughts on that before we get into this last part here in verse 4? I love how you tied into ancient proverb or song, about the sailor take warning, which is still something we do even today.
I mean, I learned that growing up, and it was something that you can pick on. And Coulter's in something. He's so convinced that there's a storm coming that he goes, it feels like there's a storm today. And we've had over the last couple of weeks some days with the humidity's high, to where you can know that you can feel that there's something different, and that's where we're very keen to pick up on this stuff, even on a subconscious level. And so Jesus is calling out the Pharisees, and that's what the word answer, the word interpret, is the same word that base with krino. They're able to judge. So Jesus judges them to be able to answer the question, and that you're able to go around and judge the sky, but you can't judge this. You're missing the entire
He
picture.
said, you're able to come to common sense conclusions with the sky already, so a sign from me you don't need, and you're missing the true signs that I've already given you.
Yeah.
And then he says, here's the problem. It's a heart problem. Verse 4.
Yep.
An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. Now, he said this before in chapter 12 when they asked him for a sign, the Pharisees and scribes. He says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. What about their question is evil and adulterous? Or what's his point? Why is it so bad? I mean, we already hit on it, but it's kind of reiterate.
Yeah.
Their heart.
Yeah, their heart. They're trying to test him. So they're evil and they're not committing physical adultery, at least I don't think. They're cheating on God is basically what it is. And it's a generation that's so fallen away from God, they can't see the forest for the trees kind of thing. They can't see the red in the sky and know the truth of the matter. So Jesus says, bad people seek after signs. And he says, and a sign will not be given except one sign. And the sign he says is going to be given is one that he mentioned already, right? Chapter 12. He says, the sign of Jonah. And he left and went away. So what in the world is the sign of Jonah?
Well, I think we need to go to what Matthew says to determine what the sign of Jonah is. So go back to chapter 12. I can read it here in starting verse 38, but verse 39. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And so it's that Jesus is going to die.
Yeah.
The sign of Jonah is that he will conquer death and be resurrected, will resurrect himself after 3 days, 3 nights.
So the true sign of whether or not you are going to follow Jesus is, do you accept the death, burial, resurrection of him? Yeah. And there is no more supernatural sign than beating death. You want a sign in the sky, here you have one coming back from the dead. And that's what we see with Jesus.
It's interesting, too. I'm going to shift gears briefly, and you can tell me to hold off on that. But Jesus left without performing a sign.
Yeah.
And this is not the first time we've seen Jesus, or Matthew, record the fact that Jesus hasn't performed any signs. And so when he went home, they were all looking for his mothers and his brothers, and he says that these are all them. And it says that no miracle was performed there. It just goes back to the purpose of the signs, what Jesus was getting across with the signs. It was to, how did you describe it in the past, to attest to the man or the message?
Yeah.
It reaffirmed the message. And here, Jesus is saying that the signs are all around you. You aren't going to see them, but there is another one coming. Pay attention to it.
And that's the one that's for everyone.
Yeah.
See, all these other miracles are kind of localized in different places, but the sign of the resurrection is one for all humanity of all time. And if they don't follow that and accept that sign, they're going to be lost. And even too, like you said, sticking with Matthew, even right after that, back in Matthew chapter 12, in verse 41, it says, the men of Nineveh, whom Jonah preached to, right, will stand up with judgment with this generation at the judgment, and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. Jesus has been preaching, he's been commanding repentance, and they are rejecting Jesus has a type of Jonah, they're rejecting him, and they're going to reject ultimately the sign of Jonah when it comes in the resurrection.
So you made a comment that it's a sign for all times.
Yeah.
And so what Matthew says here in verse 4 is an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. So does that apply to just the Sadducees and the Pharisees, or is that applicable to all of us today? If we seek for a sign, seek for a miracle, seek for direct prophecy, direct communication, is this applicable to us today, or is it just something that was directly addressed to the Pharisees and the Sadducees?
I don't want to say that 100%, but I do know that over the years of preaching, I've had several people tell me things like, if God would just tell me directly, show me directly something, then I'd be more apt to follow him. And I don't want to say that every time someone has said that to me, it's rooted in selfishness. But even think of the terminology. If God would just show me, give me special preferential treatment, then I would believe. And truthfully, I hear that more so with children, which we expect children to think juvenile thoughts like that, and childish, hey, what's for me, me, that kind of idea. That's understood. But as we mature, we should accept that here's a sign that's been given for everybody that's impartial, it's universal, and it's for all to follow. So if we want something else, we're asking for God to be a respecter of persons. If we're asking, give me another sign. At least so maybe we could be evil and adulterous in our thinking when we come across that way.
Which, to tie this and then the verse you just read in chapter 12, we have the sign of Jonah. Today, we have the sign of Jonah. The people of Nineveh repented off the preaching of Jonah.
Yeah.
Something greater than Jonah was there at that time. Something greater than Jonah is here, so we have the sign of Jonah now. And so if we ask for something additional than the sign of Jonah, then we would be considered an evil and
Yeah, we're saying Jesus isn't enough.
Well, that's what I'm saying. What's better than what better sign, what better miracle than the resurrection of a dead man?
Yeah. We got
what better? I mean, there isn't.
There's nothing else that can top that.
And look at the millions and billions and trillions and however many millions of people follow Jesus over the last 2,000 years.
Has
because
there
of
been a
that
trillion
one,
people
I have
on
no
Earth?
idea.
I don't know about your math there.
I don't know. But you get
I
my
got
point,
where you're going, yes.
So, I mean, but that's, I think, it's like Jonah had 120,000 men of Nineveh stand up and repent. And that's not what Jonah wanted, right? Jonah had a heart problem when those men turned and repented. But here's Jesus. He comes to this earth. He heals people. He shows humbly that he is God. He goes to a cross. He dies, and he's resurrected. And now, however many people across the vast amount of time that has taken place since the resurrection of Jesus, people have followed even more.
It's a powerful sign. What's the greatest sign of all?
Yeah, I mean. Yeah.
And if you reject it, you're evil and adulterous generation. So with that phrase then, he leaves them, like you mentioned, and he went away. He's like, I'm not going to waste my time. It kind of reminds me, as we look back, the week before about the Pharisees being offended. He says, leave them alone. You know what I mean? Let their blind guides guiding the blind. And here he says, look, I'm just going to leave them alone. I'm not going to waste my time anymore.
I want to look at, going back to this heart problem, the Sadducees and the Pharisees came to Jesus. And we've seen other instances, going back even to last week, where the Canaanite woman came to Jesus with a penitent heart, with a humble heart, with a humble attitude. And she received healing for her daughter because of how great her faith was. And it's the same with all the other miracles that we routed off last week. I don't have my notes in front of me from last week. But going all the way back, all these people came to Jesus and were saved in a physical sense from that. Here the Sadducees and Pharisees came to Jesus and were called an adulterous, an evil generation. It goes back to that heart issue.
So sermon idea, why do you come to Jesus?
Yeah.
What is your heart? Is it a penitent heart or a testing heart?
So we sing that song, Come to Jesus, but it's more than just
maybe
coming
we got to
to
clarify
Jesus.
why you are. Yeah.
Exactly.
So then we go on, verse 5. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. The disciples always mess up food, by the way. It seems like either we have no food, we need some food, we go to a town to get food.
Yeah, but Jesus tells them that you will leave all and follow me.
Yeah.
And so the fact that they haven't had dinner for what was look at last week for 2 or 3 days, and it just, I find myself being critical of the disciples for being concerned about this kind of stuff. But it's also they they gave up everything to follow him to where they weren't even worried about.
It's a bunch of guys together. They don't always do the best plan when it comes to food.
That is true.
Vinny always gets after me. She's
That is
like,
true.
"Did you feed the kids lunch?" I forgot that I was supposed to do that. Right? My kids were making fun of me because we went camping this weekend and I brought food from.
Cereal.
Well, no, I brought a bunch of candy bars and yogurt. I figured that's good enough. It's good to me, right? We had all the candy bars and stuff. They're like, "Did you bring any water?" I didn't bring any water, but I brought 64 cans of Diet Shasta. We were good to go. But I mean, so maybe it's just a bunch of guys together. So the disciples said they came and they forgotten to bring any bread. So Jesus said to them, verse 6, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." So they're kind of in trouble because they don't have any bread. And Jesus sometimes, I think, likes to twist around their stresses a little bit.
Yeah, but we see a little bit of that sarcastic, dry sense of humor.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of humorous. So they're worried about food. He goes, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." So they're asking, "Where's the bread?" And Jesus goes, "Do you really want bread?" I mean, it's kind of I love it. So he says, "Beware of the leaven," which yeast, of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which throughout Scripture, that's a common illustration, leaven is. But in verse 7, the disciples began to discuss this amongst themselves, saying, "He said that because we did not bring any bread." And so they're confused. They're like, "Did he say this because we didn't bring any bread? He's mad, or is he using this as a point? What's the deal here about the bread and the leaven?" In typical Jesus form, he wants to get the wheels turning in your head. Verse 8, "But Jesus, aware of this, said, 'You men of little faith.'" Oh, there's that phrase, right? We see throughout this book.
Yeah, we've seen it 3 other times. And in all those instances, it's a period of high anxiety.
Yeah.
With the 2 storms on the ocean, and Jesus calls them out as being men of little faith. And so you can see that while they were discussing their bread, there was some anxiety here, and tied with it was a lack of faith. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this happened immediately after feeding 5,000 and feeding 4,000.
And look how Jesus answers them here, right? I mean, because they just saw a miracle, and now they're still worried about bread. Jesus just fed people, thousands. And then he tells them this. He goes, "You men of little faith, why do you discuss amongst yourself that you have no bread? Why are you anxious about this? Why are you worrying about this?" Same way, why'd you worry about the storm? Why'd you worry about the food? Why are you worrying about food again? Verse 9, "Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets full you picked up? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets you picked up?" He said, "Don't you remember those 2 miracles where I fed thousands and you're worried about bread right now?" He goes, "How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread?" And then he's going to talk about what he meant in a second. But so let's talk about his first rebuke. "You of little faith, did you not think I could feed you?" It's basically what I get from this, right?
Yeah.
They're still not trusting in the providence of Jesus.
Right.
It's neat. Let me take a little bit of a step back. In verse 7, it says that the disciples were discussing it amongst themselves. Jesus calls it out in verse 8. Why are you discussing this? That word discussing is that dialogizomai.
That sounds very scholarly to me.
Yeah. But in looking at that on Bible Hub to understand that word, it's really cool. And that's what there's just so much of the, I think, Greek that we miss out on, because it's like a picture language. It describes things in more detail. And this particular word is used, and the way it's used is it indicates going back and forth in a way that leads to a confused conclusion. And so when the disciples were going back and forth, they were just confusing themselves.
So the blind leading the blind almost a little
and
bit.
it's so cool
yeah.
because
Good point.
it implies that one confused mind is interacting with other confused mind, and that further reinforcing the original confusion. And so all the disciples were going around
Making themselves more confused.
But then that's what tie that with what Jesus asks in verse 9. Do you not yet perceive? And then verse 11, how does it fail you to understand?
Right.
Which that's the Greek word is that noeo, which is apply mental effort that is needed to reach the bottom line conclusion. And so you're going around and you are not even putting thought into what you're saying. You're not doing anything for it. And then to tie that all together in verse 12, I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but that understood is another word, sienomai, which is, it describes this putting everything together, where you join facts into a comprehensive whole, that means to arrive at a summary or final understanding that's generally complete with life applications. And so we see all the way through that they go from a period of confusion. Jesus calls them out that you're confused because you're not even putting common sense into it. You're not thinking about it. And then afterwards, after Jesus smacks them upside the head, they get the picture.
That's a good conclusion. It's awesome there. Also reminds me, our Bible class right here needs to not just be a dialogue, but needs to come to understanding, right? If not, we're just confusing each other.
Talking in circles.
All we're doing is sharing confusion right now.
I gotta be honest, I zoned down a little bit. No, I'm just kidding.
No, that was good because you can see the disciples in their humanity are bouncing around all their confusion. I'm confused, they're confused, they're going around. What is this bread? What is he talking about? Jesus goes, look, I just want you to understand.
Right.
And the fact that the reason why they're just bouncing around a bunch of confusion is their lack of faith.
Yeah.
Faith helps you understand. It builds it.
Again, I like your point. High anxiety situation. This is, what does this mean? What are we supposed to do? How does this work? That's what we do in high anxiety situations, right? Is if this situation that I don't like is happening, all of a sudden I'm questioning God about what is supposed to take place in my world. Well, God, I thought you had a plan for me. What am I supposed to do now? That's what it almost seems like. Is, well, we forgot bread. So now what do we do? Who's going to go get it? Do we go to this other town? Do we keep walking past?
But it should have been, God fed us before he could feed us again.
It should have been, right.
Yeah,
maybe that's an application for us too. When we get in high anxiety situations, when we get in situations where we don't like, why aren't we saying, you know what, remember what God did in my last term of life?
God saved me before he could save me again.
Yeah. He's done this before. Why couldn't he do it again?
Yeah.
I think that's,
No, I think that's right.
Good.
And that's a good application for us because we have a hard time. We can look back at ways that God has blessed us in some way, and we'll talk about, God did this for me, that for me. But when times get difficult, we forget all that he's done for us and for some reason think he can't do it again.
Yeah, I mean, I can look back through my life with the benefit of hindsight and just see a thread connecting different things to get me to where I am now. And that's what, looking back, it's easy to see, but looking forward, it's easy to
trust
forget.
Where it's hard to trust that it's still going forward, that same plan of God.
Those trials, that's when our faith is tested. You said something one time, and I can't remember exactly what you said. What's the, I can't even remember what it was, but it was something about the idea of, we really see where we stand with God when we go through trials. I think the gist.
I think I preached that.
Did you preach that, or was it? I thought it was you. You said something like that. But
you did not.
I taught James a couple weeks ago.
Years ago. Nick wasn't even here then.
But I like that idea, right?
And that's where do we go back on? Where do we fall back on in hard times?
Right.
And that's what it's the same with the disciples.
And they fell back on.
There was a way you worded it that was really.
They fell back on a lack of faith
instead
of trust. It was amazing.
Go back and look at old text.
Right. I'll go back.
Well, let's look at what Jesus said here instead of Curtis. Okay? Jesus says, why do you not understand I'm not talking about bread? But beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So I love that he just repeats what he said. And then, now he's like, let me slow it down for you a little bit.
Okay.
Quit talking. Beware of what the Pharisees and Sadducees are doing. What they understand, verse 12. Then they understood that he did not say, beware of the leaven of the bread. Don't be afraid of bread. He says, they're all of a sudden going to start some whole church about the non-leavened church or something. He goes, but beware of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Be, afraid of what they're doing, not afraid of bread. That's his point.
So what made the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees be classified as leaven?
It was influential in some way. It has to be, because leaven has always seemed to use as it influences the whole loaf, it causes things to happen, all that. It's kind of a catalyst. Maybe the Pharisees and Sadducees, they don't just come up out of the blue. Sometimes we kind of think that all of a sudden these guys appear testing Jesus. Maybe they're amongst the crowds. Maybe they're stirring a little bit of, discourse of, dissent among the masses. And now they finally get to Jesus and they say, all right, here's our question. I was like, what's their question he's going to ask? And so I'm thinking that they've kind of been a cancer to his movement a little bit along the way. Like leaven in bread that causes an effect to the entire loaf, they're doing that here. So there's a backstory going on here that we don't see, I think.
Could it be that they might be seeing an attachment to the heart problem of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? Because, when you're, again, you've got two different leaders that are, one is right in what he's doing. The other ones are doing what are suiting. I should maybe say it this way. One is doing something that is not suiting himself for his own benefit. The other ones are doing only things that are self-suiting, self-serving. Mm-hmm. And so, who's going to be more influential? Who are you going to follow when it comes down when it comes down to it? Are you going to follow Jesus in his teaching and do things that are selfless and remember that God provides in all times and all places and all trials in life? Or are you gonna begin to question maliciously what God is doing amongst you? Who are you gonna let influence your heart?
So then, in context, what we looked at tonight is that leaven. The first four verses, excuse me, were the Sadducees and Pharisees refusing to acknowledge the sign around them and what was going on. And so here, Jesus is telling the disciples to pay attention to what's going on around you. And so would the leaven be a failure to recognize?
Yeah, I wonder if it goes back to even the idea of the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, accusing Jesus of a miracle by the devil, kind of like you said. I think that's still back there.
Yeah.
That he's not really doing miracles. He's doing it by the power of the devil. He's not working with God. That's there. And this movement of people, maybe even among the 4,000 that he's feeding, they're there. You know what I mean? We always just kind of think,
they are 1, 2, 3, 4 in that.
Yeah, they're not just showing up out of the blue. They're affecting this. So the one question that we hear or that we have recorded probably has hundreds of conversations that led up to that among the people as they're sowing the seeds of discord and spreading their false teaching. And apparently they're very skilled in their false teaching so much that Jesus has to tell us, watch out for what they're doing. And, I've given people similar caution before. I remember when I was in school, there was some different people that had some viewpoints that were wrong. And there would be a lot of conversations that happened in break rooms and libraries and outside at lunch that had to do with that teaching. And then all of a sudden in class, a question would be asked of the teacher where maybe the teacher doesn't know. Now, Jesus knows where it's coming from, but the teacher might not know all the baggage. And maybe me as a fellow student say, hey, be careful with this person. What they're doing is sowing all this. And the question they're asking is based upon all of this problem they're causing. And you probably see it in the workplace too. People will sow a bunch of problem and then ask a question to try to reiterate what they've been showing their coworkers. Same kind of idea. I think the Pharisees were doing that. They were affecting the loaf of the followers here, maybe the 4,000 he just fed, and with their leaven, and Jesus says, watch out for it, beware of what they're doing.
And it almost seems like the next, couple of sections here are, number one, the moment of clarity for the disciples, or at least one disciple. And not that disciple, we can't, but we know what he says, right? He says, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God.
Why are you jumping the gun?
I am jumping, I know, but I'm just prefacing this because they're unclear here and previously they're unclear about what Jesus is here to do and why he's doing it. They may perceive some certain things because we see that word over and over and over again. This idea of perceiving or understanding. Jesus asking, do you not yet perceive? Do you not yet understand? And in other places, he's asked them that question, and all of a sudden there's this moment of clarity for Peter that he knows who this Jesus is, and then another Jesus right on top of that in chapter 17 we go into the Transfiguration where it's really Jesus is really identified. Jesus is solidified. His identity is solidified amongst the disciples by that event. Even though we've got a string of events that are where you have little faith. You don't trust.
Yeah.
You don't.
Well, they didn't understand who he was, and the disciples didn't understand what he was teaching, and a lack of understanding leads to some crazy.
Sorry, I'm stumbling over
conclusion.
my words.
That's all right. But I think
can't get my words out. Yeah.
I think what we'll do is we'll stop right here tonight. But let's kind of maybe draw to a conclusion here. What are some takeaways? I'd say for me, what stands out as a takeaway, number one, don't try to test Jesus with a sign. I mean, don't think that don't ask for anything more than a resurrection. That's the only sign you need. The resurrection is enough. And then number two, what stands out to me is beware the influence of false teaching. Those that deny Jesus are like leaven in bread. It affects the entire loaf. I don't know if anything else stands out to you guys tonight.
No.
All right.
I agree with
well,
you.
let's take that home and apply that. Let's trust in Jesus and understand that the resurrection is enough. I thank you all for tuning in this evening. Please continue to participate in the Zoom class on Wednesday night. And if there's any way that we can help you connect, maybe in a personal Bible study or follow up with you in any way, please let us know. Have a good evening.